Yes.
Dr. Rejman, the next document I'm going to ask you to look at in the context of the HIV litigation is DHSC 0006279_031. So this is a minute from you to Dr. Pickles and others, 11th of October 1989, a note on some aspects of the meeting of UK Haemophilia Centre directors held on the 9th of October 1989 in Oxford. And then we can see there's an update given on the HIV haemophilia litigation at that meeting, which you're reporting. Just wanted to draw your attention to the last paragraph, paragraph 11, and ask you about that. So you report here that Dr. Jones, off the record, in private suggested to me that one possible way out of the difficulty would be the setting up of a royal commission to investigate the problem of HIV and haemophilia, which would remove some of the pressure and meanwhile increase the Macfarlane Trust and encourage more liberal use of the money. Now, we can see you relayed that suggestion of a royal commission to the recipients of this minute. And I'm not going to ask you specifically about how that issue was dealt with, because the documentation tells us it goes in a submission to ministers in due course, not I think, a submission authored by you. But a slightly wider question I have for you is this, Dr. Rejman. Did the Department of Health at any time during your employment there consider holding any form of public inquiry into the events that had led to people being infected in large numbers with HIV and hepatitis C?
Yes, I think in my third statement I referred to several minutes at various times where the concept of an inquiry or a commission was raised, but I think that no action was taken. I think it was just a sort of passing thought or just a comment, and that was it. I don't think anybody ever saw. So, for example, I can't remember whether, for example, in a submission, it might sort of say, this is one of the possibilities, and then nothing ever came back. And the impression that I had was that there was nobody in the department that was pushing for it, or nobody at a senior enough level for it to happen.
There were a number of inquiries, public inquiries, held during the 1990s, of which perhaps the BSE inquiry is the most obvious example, because we've already looked at aspects of its report. Did that, as far as you can recall, trigger any rethinking as to whether there should be an inquiry into infected blood and its consequences?
I'm not aware of it. I think that if people referred to the possibility of inquiry, it was very much as a sort of one paragraph in a longer minute or submission.
And then if we can look next, please, at DHSC 0007045_006. Now, these are notes of a conference with Council on the 29th of November 1989. I don't think, if we go over the page and go to the next page, I don't think we can tell from the document who has made these notes. Do you have any knowledge of who might the author be, Dr. Rejman?
No, I mean, say, looking, let me just have a look. No, I don't know. I mean, say, I don't even know whether I recognize the typeface. I mean, say, it may have been council secretary. I mean, so it's not obvious. Well, it doesn't look as though it's unlikely to have been me, because I don't think I would have put down ST bracket Sunday Time for Sunday Times or anything like that. That just doesn't sound like the thing. It may have been a note by Council's secretary, because I don't know.
In any event, I should say it's a DHSC document. It's a document that's come from Department of Health files. I just want to ask you then about the first paragraph and whether you can shed any light on it. We don't have a record of attendees at this particular conference, but you generally attended the conferences with Council, as I understand it.
Yes.
This says under the heading Journalism, whether to approach Attorney General or Judge to muzzle Sunday Times. And then it refers to Justin Fenwick, that's one of the council instructed by the department, advising that muzzling couldn't be achieved yet and that the Sunday Times article wouldn't affect the judge's mind. First of all, do you know what the reference there is to the Sunday Times, what the concern was about a publication or particular publication or campaign that it was pursuing?
I haven't the faintest idea. I mean, say, November 89, which was fairly early on in the proceedings. I don't know whether they may... You see, what are the possibilities? The possibilities are that Sunday Times reported something from a court hearing that should not have been published. That's a possibility. Because obviously when we had these hearings or whatever you like to call them with the judge, the pre-action hearings, some of what he said was for external publication, and some of it was supposed to be kept within, the plaintiff's counsel and our counsel and legal advisors. Now, obviously, I wasn't the legal advisor, but I was sort of equivalent of. So, I mean, say, I can't think what else would have prompted this, because, if the Haemophilia Society said something or other, well, you're not going to muzzle that. If the director said something, you're not going to muzzle that. So it has to be something that would not normally be in the public domain. And the only thing that I can think of at that time would have been a court hearing, the judge said something, and the Times, I'm not sure whether journalists were there at well, they may have been there at some of the court hearings, and they may well have been told this is not for publication, and they may have broken the rules. I don't know. I think the short answer is you don't know what it refers to. I'm sorry, no.
But do you recall any internal discussions within the department about the idea of muzzling a national newspaper, which might seem a somewhat surprising one at first blush, at least?
Well, the question really, in fact, is who proposed it? It obviously wasn't Justin Fenwick. And it wouldn't have been, was that Andrew Collins was there?
Yes.
So it wouldn't have been him. So the only people that might have suggested it would have been an administrator, possibly. I mean, that is my guess, because nobody else would suggest it. And obviously, because the administrators were so much more aware of political sensitivities, etc., I think it might well have come from them. I doubt it would have come from me, to be honest.
Moving on from that then to a meeting in January 1990, MHRA 0017634, please, Paul. So this is, again, somebody's note. We can just see it. It says, I attended a meeting with Dr. Rejman, Mr. Canavan and Mr. Brand, which we discussed who might be approached to give evidence on the department's behalf. Who was Mr. Brand? Do you recall?
Mr. Brand was a solicitor who worked within Mr. Powell's branch. But he was a junior solicitor.
And if we go over the page, we can see the date of this at the bottom is the 26th of January 1990. There's various handwritten notes, and if we just go to the next page, there's some more handwritten notes. Is any of this your handwriting, Dr.
No.
And then if we go back to the first page, then it may be that this was authored by Mr. Powell, but I think that's probably speculation on my part. But in any event, it's somebody within the department reporting on a meeting with you, Mr. Canavan and Mr. Brandt. And then if we can just look at what's said. As regards CMO letters, these are prepared by the division responsible, though the CMO can accept or reject them. In this respect, we would need to speak to Diana McInnes. And then, if we just go further down the page, towards the bottom of the page, there's then a discussion of various other people who may be able to give evidence. Sorry, can we go further down, Paul? Last paragraph. And then it says, as regards communicable diseases generally, Hilary Pickles was the doctor involved. The role of the department generally, so far as communicable diseases is concerned, is that we do not indicate what treatment we should carry out. We would keep doctors informed and act as a clearinghouse, but no more. And then over the page, top of the next page, the role of prevention generally see, and then there's a suggestion of presumably somebody else within the department, John Middleton. The general scheme is that the department tends to be reactive at passing on information where necessary. Ultimately, the decision as to whether to be proactive and encourage any particular course is a matter for ministers governed by public opinion in any particular case. Now, I'm hoping, Dr. Rejman, that you might be able to help us unpick a little of what was being discussed here. First of all, do you have any recollection of the particular meeting?
No.
So one of the themes of this meeting appears to be about the circumstances in which the department, whether through the chief medical officer or otherwise, might issue information, guidance relevant to the question of risk or treatment to avoid risk. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
In terms of CMO letters, which was the topic, if we go back to the first page, in the second paragraph, what understanding did you have by 1989, 1990 of the circumstances in which the chief medical officer might issue a CMO, dear doctor, dear regional health manager letter?
Well, I was involved in, I think, about two or three, or two definitely, CMO letters. And basically, they were usually about policy, so therefore the administrative relevant branch and division would be involved. And then the medics involved would also be, and it was a case that the medics would provide a lot of the background, and in fact they might provide the majority of the text of the CMO letter, particularly if it's a medical letter, then that would be appropriate. And one had to justify the need for a CMO letter because CMO letters were not that common. I don't know how many there were in a year, but I'm trying to think. The HCV look back was number 4 or something like that, and that was April. So that doesn't suggest that, you know, they were coming out every week or anything remotely like that. So I suspect that what would have happened would have been that the medics and the admin people would decide, look, this particular topic merits a CMO letter. And I think there was that discussion about whether a CMO letter would be appropriate or not in one of the things in my third statement. And I think that here, I don't know the actual background to what is being discussed here, but presumably somebody somewhere wondered whether this was important enough to justify a CMO letter. Because as Roger Schofield mentioned in his minute when we were discussing CMO letters, it's a letter that goes to all medical practitioners. That's 144,000 people. Now, obviously there are costs involved, but probably what's more important is not the cost, but that each CMO letter should have some gravitas. There should be a good reason for it. If it's not of any importance, it shouldn't be there. And in a sense, one always, and I think this is what CMO's office, he had a secretary, and presumably that's Diana McInnes, that, well, I say secretary, it's a medic who was working as his secretary. She would look at it, she'd discuss it with CMO and say, look, are you agreed that this is okay? They'd look at the draft, and then CMO would obviously make the final decision. Now, whether ministers were, it might be in some instances that a minister might be also asked, a junior minister might be asked, is he happy? Because obviously anything that comes from CMO is official DH, and therefore is responsible to DH, and therefore ministers should be aware.
And then if we look at the bottom of the page, now I can obviously pick this up with Dr. Pickles, but although she's the doctor referred to, she's wasn't present at this meeting. So the last paragraph, if we can just zoom in on that again, Paul. Do you understand, or are you able to assist us in understanding what's meant in relation to communicable diseases, that we would keep doctors informed and act as a clearinghouse, but no more?
I'm surprised about that comment about Hilary Pickles being the doctor involved in communicable diseases, because there was a division within the department which was specifically communicable diseases. And unless Dr. Pickles had moved there away from my branch, then she would not have been the one involved, because the communicable diseases division was the one that the AIDS unit were part of, for example. So I'm surprised about that. And as I say, without knowing the precise context, I can't really help.
I can pick that up with Dr. Pickles on Thursday. And then if we just go over the page, it says, it's just the top paragraph, the role of prevention generally. See John Middleton, CMP1. What's CMP1, do you know? Or do you know who Mr. Middleton was?
I don't know. I mean, say, because the department was very much split into different divisions, which each had a specific role, but also within those specific roles, you might find things that you wouldn't expect to be there, you know. So, you know, CMP means nothing to me. Sorry. And
then, do you have any reflection on what's said in the second sentence, which is a more general point, in the context of what's said to be prevention? The department tends to be reactive at passing on information where necessary, as distinct from proactive. Is that a fair representation of the way in which the department generally conducted itself?
Generally, yes, but it obviously depended upon the importance of the topic and the severity of disease that might relate to it. So, for example, I can't think of something, but, you know, for example, if there were an outbreak of, I don't know, Legionella or whatever, then depending upon how common that was and how severe the impact was, how many people were infected, what the source of the problem was, then the department might be proactive and actually tell the people there what to do. But most of the time, the department was there as a support to other people to do what was their role.
And then, are you able to assist us with the second paragraph on that page? It says the annual report of the department might have some information. Now, conscious there was an annual report issued by the Chief Medical Officer.
Yes.
Was there an annual report issued by the department that you're aware of?
No, I think the annual report presumably there refers to the Chief Medical Officer's report, which I think I referred to in my statement. And in essence, the annual report was about public health in, I'm not sure they included Wales, England definitely, might have included Wales. And it gave figures and general information. But what tended to happen was that in each annual report, the CMO would choose a particular topic which he or she, as it was when Sally Davis was there, they would highlight, and they'd actually go into it in a lot more detail. And this was particularly if it was a topic that was at that time something relevant, something had happened.
And then we can take that down, but just still on the topic of publication of information by the department or the CMO, but I'm moving away here from the haemophilia litigation for a moment. I want to just look at a later document from the then CMO, Sir Kenneth Coleman, MHRA 00345594_014. Now, this is a minute from the Chief Medical Officer, 21st of June 1996, and we can see the subject is whether there should be a CMO letter in relation to CJD. And we can, you were one of a long list of people who were copied into this document. Now, I'm not asking you anything about CJD at the moment, Dr. Rejman. If we go over the page, we can just see the observations in paragraphs 6 and 7, and I really wanted to ask you about this more generally rather than in the context of CJD.
Yes.
A CMO letter would be a simple means of imparting what we know about CJD and new variant CJD and their epidemiology, and then Sir Kenneth sets out a range of issues which could, where information could be communicated. And then paragraph 7, he says the document would contain nothing new and would merely be a statement of what is known, giving advice where appropriate. Dissemination of the facts will reduce speculation and the spread of misinformation and ensure the best advice is passed on to the public, particularly about the safety of various products. It will also counter criticisms that the department is withholding information. So Sir Kenneth there sets out a number of benefits, if I can put it that way, or advantages of issuing a CMO letter.
Yes, but I think this particular CMO letter, the circumstances are very specific, because here we have a situation where new variant CJD has become known in the public domain. And members of the public are obviously asking GPs and others about it. And this CMO letter is actually explaining what new variant CJD is and putting it into context with sporadic CJD and GSS and the various other forms of CJD. Whereas the CMO letters that I was involved in were actually stating new policy. So the CMO letter about look back, the CMO letter about payment for HIV in blood transfusion, that was something that was new, informing people what they need to do. Whereas this particular one is purely information. It's not actually saying to people, you need to do this, you need to do that.
So that your answer, Dr. Rejman, if I may say so, might tend to suggest that the CMO letter is potentially quite a flexible tool, and there might be a range of circumstances in which it could be appropriate to deploy.
Very much so.
So if we then revert back, following that detour to the HIV litigation, one aspect of your work was involvement in relation to identifying and liaising with expert witnesses.
Yes.
And if we just look briefly at DHSC 00149440_006, do you need that again? Have I given the wrong number of digits? DHSC 00149440 _006. So this is an action note following an office meeting on the 20th of November. I suspect that's November 1989. And there's a range of different areas of work set out, and we can see at the bottom of the page refers to expert witness reports. Dr. Rejman, who's in the lead on this item, informed the meeting of outstanding work, and then there's various action points. And then if we just go over the page, if we go to the third page, just still on the topic of expert reports, the last paragraph records council's advice that expert witnesses should look at the discovery and give an expert opinion. It was agreed that the best approach would be for experts to see a defined part of the discovery relevant to the area of expertise. Now, can you assist us in understanding how you went about the task of identifying and instructing experts within the context of the HIV litigation?
Well, in essence, we had particular topics that we wanted to address in the HIV litigation. And what I was asked to do was to try to identify expert witnesses in each of those particular subject areas. Now, some of the expert witnesses were people that I knew personally, and so therefore it would have been easy for me to say to them, would you mind being an expert witness? So I could do it, it would be formally in a sense, but in another sense, it's somebody I know, so therefore when I write to them, or I can chat to them over the phone first of all before writing to them formally to ask them. And I would decide if there was somebody who I knew who would fit the bill for that particular subject area. Now, one of the difficulties was with haemophilia and haemophilia treatment, because all of the expert witnesses in the UK would have been doctors who had been part of the infection problem. And so trying to get a completely independent expert witness report from one of those would have been, well, impossible, really, to be honest. But nevertheless, looking at the people that I knew from the UK HCDO, there were some that sounded as though they were people that probably would give a balanced view. And that's what we wanted. We wanted a balanced view. Look at the papers. If you want to, tell us what you did, but that doesn't necessarily need to be there. But tell us on the balances on the papers, what do you make of it? So that was the haemophilia directors. There were others like in hepatitis, so I would probably go to people from the ACVSB for that. Other aspects, we did actually go abroad for some of our witnesses. We went to a blood transfusion expert in the United States, for example, to get a view. From the blood transfusion point of view, obviously Dr. Gunson was going to be the person that we would ask, because obviously he was the most senior doctor in the transfusion service in England and Wales. And Dr. Lane, as head of BPL, would be asked for witness. We actually asked Dr. Perry, who was head of PFC, to be an expert witness. And then there were people about AIDS. We could ask them. We asked an epidemiologist, Professor Rose. So there was a whole group of different subjects that we would ask. And in essence, one of the other things that I think was important when we were considering expert witnesses was, is this somebody who will speak well in a court of law? So the last thing we wanted was a highbrow scientist who was brilliant at his work, but when it came to explaining his work, particularly to people who are not scientists in his field didn't come across. So, you know, one had to sort of strike a bit of a balance there, and that was obviously one of the other considerations.
And if we just look at that last passage on this screen, it says about expert witnesses should look at the discovery and give an expert opinion, and the recommendation is experts should see a defined part of the discovery relevant to the area of expertise. Who decided what documents the individual expert should see? Was that you?
That will probably be me.
Did the documents that went to the experts include the documents, or some of the documents, that were subsequently identified as covered by PII, Public Interest Immunity?
I honestly couldn't tell you. I think the documents that they would have been given would have been the ones that we had as our discovery, but also I seem to recall that I went through the MSc and I
So that's the main
copied
statement of
bits
claim.
of the MSc that were relevant to their particular bits. So, for example, if it was a hepatitis expert, I would copy the bits in the MSc which is about hepatitis, and also if they had a list of documents that they were using to justify the case, then I'd give them a list of those documents as well.
Now, you mentioned, I think, a few moments ago, words to the effect of wanting to get was it a balanced view? I think
Yes.
might have been the phrase you used. If we look at DHSC 00400903_018, please, Paul. This is a minute dated the 15th of August 1989 from Mr. Canavan to you.
Yes.
In the first paragraph, it says this. In a discussion Mr. Arthur had with Mr. Powell before his annual leave, Sol C3 asked again for names of expert witnesses for the defendants. We advised the difficult, if not impossible, task of finding a haemophilia centre director untouched by the litigation and who could give independent testimony supportive of the department's case. Now, it's that last phrase I'm interested in, Dr. Rejman. It suggests there that the search was for experts who might give evidence supportive of the department's position.
I think this is very early on in the litigation because obviously I haven't yet identified any expert witnesses. And I think what Dr. Canavan is saying there is not so much supportive of the department's case, but if we know a particular expert is publicly known to be critical of what the department is doing or has done, then perhaps we should seek another witness, because in a sense that's also part of being independent, isn't it? If, for example, Professor whoever is publicly saying this, that and the other, and if he's said that in public, then how will he appear in a court of law? You know, in a sense, he's not going to be suitable as a witness. So I think, in a sense, that may be more of what John Canavan was saying there, rather than saying every witness has got to be somebody signed up to our party line. And we knew full well that the expert witnesses that we called, yes, some of them would be more friendly than others. Some of them would be, you know, say it as it is, and really we didn't know where they were coming from. And some of them we knew were going to be critical, and we accepted that. And the question with expert witnesses is, I mean, say my understanding, I'm not a lawyer obviously, but my understanding from that time was that you ask the expert witness to provide a report. I read the report invariably first. I would then put my comments about that report. You know, are there any areas in the report which I think are incorrect, for example, particularly if an expert witness was going outside their expertise, because sometimes an expert witness that you ask them about one topic would then go into another topic where their expertise was not that good, and therefore they made a mistake. So I'd highlight that. And then I'd send this to Ron Powell and the administrators and also any relevant medical colleagues and ask them for their comments. And then, armed with this, we'd send this to council, and not always, but sometimes I would meet up with council and the expert. Now, having read the report, I might, for example, say, well, having read this report, I'm not really sure that it helps the case, not just our case, but the case at all. I think what the expert has said is really not that relevant, and I'm not really sure that we want to use him because of that reason, that what he said is that. Now, sometimes we actually went back to an expert and said, well, look, you know, you've missed this out, you've missed that out, you've missed that out. Do you want to do a second witness statement, including these particular items? And sometimes they did, sometimes they said, no, I've given you mine, give me, you know, pay me my dues for having done it, and we'll call it today. So it was all variable, put it like that.
Just look at a handful of further documents in relation specifically to individual experts. MHRA 0017661. So we can see this is you, November 1989, to Mr. Powell.
Yes.
Reporting a discussion you'd had with Professor Bloom.
Yes.
Paragraph 3 refers to him reporting to you he'd been asked by health authorities to act as an advisor. And then, sorry, if we go down the rest of the... and then paragraph 5, Professor Bloom is recorded as saying he feels too busy to be able to help in a total capacity. But you suggest to him that because of his particular expertise, particularly since he was one of the members of EGA, it would be very helpful if he could give us some advice. And he said he may be able to help on an ad hoc basis. Now, Professor Bloom was never going to be able to give true independent expert evidence, was he?
Well, no, because as I mentioned earlier, he was a haemophilia treater, and therefore he can't.
And he was chair of UKHCDO.
He was chair of UKHCDO, but that, in fact, could be an advantage, could be a disadvantage. The advantage is that he knew what happened, and he was probably more aware of what had happened. The disadvantage, obviously, is that if people were critical of UKHCDO or of him, then that was a problem. But my understanding is that an expert witness coming before a court is not going to be criticised, because ultimately the court wants to hear what he has to say. They're not interested in anything else. A court won't say, well, look, you've got so many haemophiliacs that have been infected. Why is that? I suspect a court wouldn't ask that. A court would be interested in what he has to give to the court. And it's interesting that here we're talking about that there was a possibility he might have been actually acting for some of the plaintiffs in the Republic of Ireland. So, you know, expert witnesses might be on one side or on the other side, and I think that happened with one or two of the expert witnesses that we used. I think ultimately Professor Bloom prepared a expert witness statement which was actually for the health authorities, which they then shared with us.
Had you been aware at this time, as a matter of fact, that Professor Bloom had been involved in providing advice and information to the department and had been involved in the attending the subcommittee on biologicals of the Committee on the Safety of Medicines in July 1983, which had looked at the question of whether to ban the import of concentrates. In other words, he'd been intimately entwined with
Yes.
the government's decision-making in relation to response to AIDS 83-84. Did you know that?
Well, I may well have found out afterwards, but I think in a sense, the fact that somebody has been on a government committee, and you see, I think the thing is you have to always remember a lot of these committees, people refer to them as government committees because, you know, was the ACVSB a government committee? Well, okay, the chairman was a government official, but it doesn't make it a government committee because it is full of all the members are experts who are not government officials. So to be a true government committee, it has to have either all the members being government or the vast majority being government. So I think the fact that Professor Blum was on the CSM or whatever, well, the CSM was not a government committee. It was an advisory committee on safety of medicines, and that is answerable to government and to ministers, because the ministers are the licensing authority, but it's not a government committee in that sense. It's not as though it's just government people, because the majority would not have been government people, because the expertise definitely was not held by government.
If we just to complete the picture in relation to Professor Bloom,
yes.
Look at DHSC 0004360_114. DHSC 0004360_114. This is another minute from you, Dr. Rejman, 27th of July 1990, to Mr. Powell.
Yes.
And we can see the subject matter of this minute is the report from Professor Bloom, which, as you just said, had been passed to the department by the solicitors for the health authorities. If we just look at the bottom of the page, paragraph 7, you say, in general, the report is interesting to read and contains some important information. However, in certain parts, it reads like a defence of the actions of the Haemophilia Centre directors and Professor Bloom in particular, rather than a, top of the next page, dispassionate view of an independent expert witness. And then you go on to identify some comments not helpful to the central defendant. So that was your view at the time reading the report, that it didn't in fact fulfil the function of being an independent expert report?
Well, I think, you know, I'm giving a view, and it's up to others to decide whether they accept my view or not, because I think what was important with this was that I was giving a view, and it was up to others to look at my view and say, well, yes, Dr. Rejman has got this right. We think we need to do something about this. Or it was up to them to say, well, no, they disagree. They feel that there is enough in there for being an independent expert witness. So I suspect that if the case had gone to trial, on the basis of what I read there now, we may not have used him as our expert witness, because if you look higher up there, I refer to Dr. Elizabeth Main, who was our haemophilia expert witness, and presumably her report we felt was more independent.
I'm not going to go into the detail or content or any kind of comparison between Professor Bloom's report and Dr. Main's report, but would it not be right that Dr. Main, as a reference centre director and as herself someone who had treated many patients substantially with commercial concentrates, and somebody, many of whose patients were infected with HIV in consequence of their treatment, wouldn't the same potential difficulties arise in relation to Dr. Main as an independent expert witness as it would in relation to others?
Yes, well, Dr. Main, as you know, was the Haemophilia Centre Director for Belfast. Now, a lot of the question is, how is what you're saying phrased, and how does it come across to a person reading it? Now, Dr. Main, yes, I mean, say every haemophilia director around the country had HIV positive patients. Well, possibly some of the very smallest centres might not, but those would be very small centres, and they would not be specialist haemophilia doctors. They'd be doctors that do other work, and haemophilia is very much a side issue. So trying to find somebody who hadn't got any HIV-infected patients would be, well, it would be impossible. I don't think that is it, fact. Now, how Dr. Main phrased her expert witness report may have been very different from Professor Bloom. She may well have said, you know, this happened, we were using this, we didn't expect HIV, nobody knew about HIV obviously before 1982, but we didn't expect this to happen. This has happened, we tried our best, we did this, we did that, and reading it, yes, you know that her patients have become infected, have suffered, some of them probably have died by then. But nevertheless, you read it and it sounds as though it's somebody that is trying to get information to the court without saying, oh, but I did this right, oh, but I did this right, oh, but I did this right. And I think the problem, as you alluded to earlier on, is that because Professor Bloom was involved in so many committees, and he was a very important person across the haemophilia community. Even in obviously, by the time I came on board, he was no longer quite as significant in the haemophilia community, and then he stopped becoming chairman, and other people were chairman after him. But he, in fact, because he had been involved in so many things, it would have been very easy to find, you know, should he have done this better, should he have done that better? And I think that is always the risk that, you know, in retrospect, one looks at these things and says, oh, well, perhaps this would have been done better or whatever. But my reading of that minute is that Professor Bloom's report, as it stood at that time, would have come across in a court of law as being at least partly defending his own actions. And I don't know, you see, I think the point is he wasn't our expert witness, therefore in some respects not up to us to get him to change it. We could have obviously, and I suspect we did, say to the health authorities, look, we've read this expert witness report. We suggest that you ask Professor Bloom, would he be prepared to tone this bit down, tone that bit down, you know, change the emphasis or whatever, which is what we did with our expert witnesses if we thought they were going off tangent or whatever. And you see, in this particular case, it might have been that looking at his expert witness report, with a few changes, it might have been acceptable.
Now, you told us a few minutes ago that when you received the reports from the experts, you'd be the first person within the department to get them, you'd read them. There are in the voluminous papers that you've seen for the purposes of giving evidence a number of examples of minutes that you've written commenting on the report of Dr. Gunson or the report of Dr. Perry or the report of Dr. Main. I don't particularly want to take time going to any of them individually, although I'm very happy to if it would assist. But I think it's right to say that in your minutes, you normally identify if there are criticisms of the department in the report.
Yes.
What was the purpose of that identification? Was there something you expected colleagues to do with that information?
Well, in essence, it was so that colleagues were aware, because, see, I think you have to remember that not everybody's going to spend that amount of time reading these expert witnesses, and some of them were very long, a lot of them were detailed, a lot of them you needed a bit more medical knowledge to be able to understand exactly what was being said. And so my task was to look at the expert witness report and say, you know, highlight particular aspects and say, this is useful, this is less useful. Here he's criticising the department. And I think the thing is, because see, it is actually afterwards going to go to council. And it's important that council is aware, because if council is preparing his case, and it can be useful to get an expert witness that criticises you, because then you know what the other side may criticise you over, and therefore you can prepare a response.
One of the expert reports, which I think your minutes identified as perhaps more critical of the department than some of the others, was the report from Professor Rose.
Yes.
I don't think we need to go to the accompanying minute. It's dated the 27th of April 1990, and for the transcript, it's DHSC 0046942_017, where you're passing on to Mr. Powell Professor Rose's preliminary report, and you say that some of the comments are critical, and then you identify some of those criticisms. I just want to ask you, again, it's about process rather than substance, Dr. Rejman, but to look at Professor Rose's report, it's at MHRA 0017604. Now, I just want to take you to a couple of the what might be regarded as the criticisms, and then ask you what your expectation was in terms of how the department would deal with that. So if we go to the second page, and I should make it clear, there are other aspects of the report that I'm not going to refer to where Professor Rose says, I don't criticise the department for X, Y and Z. But we can see a couple of examples of criticisms. First of all, subparagraph C towards the bottom of the page, towards the top of the page, where halfway down that paragraph, having said he didn't regard the department as culpable in underestimating the need for concentrates, he says, nevertheless, they failed to move as vigorously and efficiently as they should in order to increase the UK supplies, even in relation to the lower figures. And then if we skip over the next, I'll read the next sentence. More could have been obtained from Scotland. Management of BPL seems to have fallen short of a reasonable standard, etc. So that's one criticism. And then if we go to the bottom half of the page, the second paragraph that's on the screen refers to Kenneth Clark stating no conclusive proof that AIDS was transmitted by blood, technically correct, but indicated a fallacious approach to policy. Evidence is never beyond question. Policy decisions should never demand proof. By the end of 1983, sufficiently probable AIDS was transmitted by blood, that vigorous action was appropriate to reduce risk. Dangers of inaction were great. So there's a couple of examples. As I say, there are other passages which say I don't criticise the department for other things. When the department received that kind of information from one of its experts, what was it that you anticipated might be done? Would the department jettison that expert and try and find a different one, or would the department investigate the criticisms? Did you have an expectation as to what would happen?
Well, I don't think that... I think the question really ultimately was for council whether we hang on to the expert or not, because council was obviously the person deciding. Now, if a report contains, well, there are two things. I mean, so just quickly glancing at this report, I would put it to council. I don't know what I said to council at the time, but some of what he's talking about is outside his expertise. When he's talking about BPL production, etc., I'm sorry, if you're going to make comments about that, you need to know a lot about fractionation, you need to know about what was feasible, what was possible, and some of that reads almost like what you'd read in a newspaper, not in an expert witness report. So, you know, that's the thing that sort of jumps out at me, that, you know, he's saying some things where, as an epidemiologist, I'm not really sure that the way that he's phrased it there really holds fire. And I can't remember, I'm not sure whether I recommended Professor Rose or who recommended Professor Rose. Now, he is obviously a very eminent person, judging by all his titles and everything else and all his letters after his name. But having said that, council would have to decide, do we want somebody who is famous on the witness stand where, you know, every second thing he says is going to be criticising the department? Or do we actually look at what he says, prepare our defence on the basis that somebody else may well say this, so in a sense use him to help our defence, but don't actually put him on the stand? Because I don't know, you see, I don't know whether I've ever met Professor Rose, and I don't know how he would have performed, you know, in a witness box. So I don't know. I think all that I can say is, on the basis of glancing through that report, you know, 30 years later, I can see that there are items in it that I would have had some concerns about.
And then, if we could then go to DHSC 0038699_015. This is a minute from you, June 1990. Now, although it refers to Professor Rose in paragraph 2, I'm not specifically asking you anything further about Professor Rose. But this appears to refer to difficulties in finding an independent epidemiologist.
Yes.
And paragraph 4, you say a possible anxiety is that those people who were involved in studying the outbreak of AIDS and its general spread may feel that in court they would have to justify their particular views at the time and so might not be truly independent. That would be all the more so, would it not, in relation to the Haemophilia Centre directors?
Yes, because I think the thing is that ultimately, I think when you ask somebody to be an expert witness, they know that they are going public and that anything they say may be misconstrued, they may be criticised over it or whatever. And we had difficulties in getting AIDS experts that were prepared to act for us. I don't know whether in the end we did actually get somebody, but I think several, well, one or two of them that we invited to be expert witnesses turned us down. Now, I don't know whether they turned us down because they felt that they couldn't be seen to be supportive of government and the department, or whether it was that they didn't feel comfortable in going to a court of law, because obviously this is 5 years after AIDS testing had come on and 8 years after AIDS had first been discovered. And time had moved on, and some of what they said in the early years might no longer be accepted. And I think people do sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable in those circumstances.
Did you ever give consideration to, or do you recall anyone suggesting that you should, to approaching Dr. Spence Galbraith?
I was not aware of his existence, because that was well before I was there. I didn't know who he was.
Can I move then, still within the HIV litigation, to ask you about your role in relation to disclosure or discovery of documents? Before we look at any particular document or any particular issue, what can you recall about your role in the litigation in relation to documentation?
Well, in essence, discovery was basically going through all the papers that we had and to see whether any of them might be of some help in the litigation. So it was basically a case of my going through my filing cabinet, and obviously this was anything that had been left there from the previous person that had done my job, taking into account that there was a year when there was nobody in that job, and therefore things might have got lost. And obviously, I'm not sure whether I presume you must have asked Hilary Pickles about any documents that she might have. But you see, Hilary Pickles was actually involved in the AIDS unit at the time anyway, in the mid-80s. So her documentation would be a bit different from documentation directly relating to haemophiliacs. So I would have gone through my filing cabinet, my administrative colleagues would have gone through their filing cabinets, and they obviously had the official files. So they could go to those files to look there. And then we would have asked the AIDS unit, because they might have had some, obviously a lot less, but they might have had some useful information there. And then presumably would have gone to MCA. So basically doing a trawl round the department, any particular branches that might have something that might be useful. And then bringing all these papers together, and then I suspect, well, I think it was David Burridge and I would have gone through them very sort of quickly and say, yes, this looks like it's reasonable, or no, it doesn't, send it back to whoever we got it from, or to my own filing cabinet or David's filing cabinet, and really just go through that. Now, it's never 100% system. I'm sure that there must have been documents that we said were not relevant, but which, you know, if you analyse them very, very carefully, they might have been relevant. But I think, in a sense, we tried to err on the side of over-including than under-including in the discovery.
And can you just explain what the distinction is between the files that would have been, as you put it, in your filing cabinet, and what would be the official files?
Yes. I've explained this, I think, in my first statement. In essence, the difference is that the official files would have a file number, as we saw in that business about the destruction of the files, and they would contain all the important documentation from that relevant time. So that would be minutes, submissions, anything generated by the department, basically. And they would have an official number, and they would be stored, and they would be accessible, and people know where they are, and you could actually go to them. Now, my files were basically a filing cabinet with different sections. So, for example, I'd have a section about HIV and haemophilia, which obviously is getting bigger and bigger and bigger by the day. And then I'd have another one about anti-D immunoglobulin, for example. So I'd have sections within my filing cabinet, and I'd go to those sections and I'd haul out everything. And within my sections, there would be some of the minutes that I had generated, or that had been copied to me or sent to me, or letters sent to me, or letters that I had sent back. But also my cabinet would have a series of scientific articles. So, for example, if I saw something interesting in the Lancet, I'd photocopy it and put it in the filing cabinet. And that's what I did, for example, with the ACVSB. You know, something interesting, photocopy it, send it around, file it. So my files were different. So when it came to drawing up the discovery in mid-1995, there were two sources of those documents. There was my filing cabinet, which is obviously a lot fewer documents, but contained scientific documents. And then there were the official files, which contained all the minutes that had come to that branch or had come from that branch, and any letters that they had received.
And so just going back to the HIV haemophilia litigation,
yes.
you've described to us that you do that process of looking through your files.
Yes.
And your files would include, what we're calling your files, the files of your predecessors, is that right?
They would, whatever was left from my predecessor. This is the question, because sometimes people, you see, if people left, then they themselves might decide to destroy particular documents. Because, for example, they might say, well, this is just of no interest to man or beast, so it can be binned. So one could never say that it was 100% of what that particular person had. But it was what was remaining from that person, and obviously people had a good idea of what was likely to be important. And so therefore they would keep that so that their successor didn't start, from a standing start, so to speak.
So did what we're describing as your files then include files that have been the files of Dr. Smithers and before her the files of Dr. Wolford, who had held briefs in relation to haematology, or were they different predecessors?
Because the files that I would have had would have been the files held by the SMO, not the principal medical officer. And Dr. Wolford was the principal medical officer, so her files, presumably, Dr. Pickles inherited.
And so in addition to doing that exercise that you've described in relation to your files and those of surviving from your predecessor, do I also understand that someone in the administrative branch having done an equivalent exercise, you and Mr. Burridge then would look at all that material and try and say relevant, not relevant, relevant, not relevant?
Yes.
Did you have any guidance given to you about what was or was not relevant?
Well, I think we went on the basis of haemophilia, HIV. Now, if you had both of them in the particular document, that's fine. If you had one or other of them, you'd have to have a careful look and see, well, is this something that might be useful? So, for example, with haemophilia, it might be just about haemophilia, but it might be something about how haemophilia services were managed, for example. A predecessor to that, whatever it was, the circular that I did about haemophilia care. So that might be kept there. And then we do the similar exercise with hepatitis, although, as I explained in my statement, hepatitis prior to the end of the 80s was not something that people actually paid much attention to, because it was relevant in the early 70s when you had the hepatitis B outbreak in the various centres for dialysis around the country. But then it stopped being so relevant. Rosenheim came out, people were being careful to avoid needle stick injuries, we had screening for hepatitis B and everything, so it no longer was so important. So I suspect that the number of documents for hepatitis would have been a lot less, although there would have been documents about hepatitis and haemophilia, because looking back, well before heat treatment was finally, well, actually heat treatment, as I explained, one of those things, did actually start in 79 in Germany, but in fact it was very much in a small scale in part of Germany, and it wasn't worldwide. Proper heat treatment didn't come on board until 84, 85, but in the years before that, the haemophilia directors were looking at possibilities of heat-treated factor VIII, so it was an issue, so to speak.
Just sticking, perhaps with one last document before we break for the afternoon's break, just sticking with the mechanics of the disclosure exercise, if I may. DHSC 000142. I just wondered if you can help us with this. So this is a handwritten note, February 1990, so in the context of the HIV haemophilia litigation, and we can see it's documents for discovery. And it's addressed to you, could you please let me have the originals of the docs from the list, which are highlighted in yellow. I'm gathering the docs for John Canavan to look through before passing them on to Soles before the end of this week. Now, we don't have yellow highlighting, unfortunately, but if we go over the page, we can see someone has annotated on the right-hand side Dr. R and then brackets K or Dr. RB, and then there are other files where what we've got is something else written. For example, the fourth item down has got H/B13/16 volume A. Can you assist us with what those notations refer to, at least insofar as they refer to Dr. R, which is presumably you?
Well, Dr. R presumably is me. This is from David Burridge. David Burridge and I had prepared a list of particular topics, and K was a particular topic and B was a particular topic. And looking at the two that are there, obviously the first one has something to do with, well, is it factor 8 or is it hepatitis that is the relevant thing? And then the second one is obviously about the NBTS just generally, because that's about the NBTS. So presumably there was a list of topics, and that is what that relates to. And
would you have been trying to identify these from your files or from the official files, or was it impossible for you to say at this stage?
Well, my guess is that whenever we had a listing, it would be a combination of the two. Because, to be frank, to split them would be, there'd be no point in splitting them. So I presume that these would be the files that David Burridge had and I had, but obviously probably not other people like AIDS Unit and MCA. Theirs would probably have come under a separate listing.
Sir, given the time, perhaps the right moment to take the afternoon break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break now until 5 to 4. So we'll come back at 5 to 4.
Thank you.